Margaret lived in a grand mansion in the Boston suburbs, surrounded by the luxury her business success had brought. At 50, she took pride in her journey and the family she had built. Paul, her same-aged husband, was a charming and handsome man, and Lisa, their 20-year-old adopted daughter, was seen by all as the perfect heiress to the Donovan fortune. On a sunny afternoon in April 2024, Margaret was driving back home after an important meeting in the city. She was distracted, thinking about her company's expansion plans when suddenly, an out-of-control truck crossed her path. The impact was devastating. Margaret's car flipped several times before coming to a stop in a ditch. Paramedics arrived quickly and took her unconscious to the hospital. Paul, visibly shaken, was beside Lisa in the hospital waiting room. He held the young girl's hand, trying to comfort her. "She'll be okay, I'm sure of it," Paul said, trying to hide his own distress. "But what if she doesn't wake up?" Lisa asked, tears in her eyes. Doctors entered the room, their expressions serious. "Your wife is in a coma," explained Dr. Thompson. "We're doing everything we can, but we don't know when or if she'll wake up." That afternoon, friends and relatives began arriving at the hospital to offer support. In front of everyone, Paul seemed even more worried, forcing himself to show an expression of despair. "I don't know what I'll do if she doesn't wake up," Paul told a family friend, squeezing his eyes to hold back tears. "Margaret means everything to us." Lisa, by his side, watched her father with a mix of concern and confusion, unaware of the slight exaggeration in his performance. Weeks passed, and the Donovan mansion became quiet and gloomy. Paul and Lisa tried to maintain their routine, but Margaret's absence was palpable. Lisa, especially, seemed more distant and introspective. On a cold gray morning, Paul sat in Margaret's office, surrounded by piles of documents and company bills. He ran his fingers over the papers, a worried expression on his face. The door opened slowly, and Lisa entered, looking hesitant. "Dad, how are you holding up?" Lisa asked, her voice low and uncertain. Paul sighed, leaning back in his chair. "I'm trying to keep everything in order, but it's hard without her here. Margaret has always been the strength of this family." Lisa approached and placed her hand on Paul's shoulder. "We'll get through this. She'll come back to us." Paul nodded, but his distant look indicated doubts. They sat in silence for a moment, lost in thought. The ticking of the clock on the wall seemed to echo through the empty room, accentuating the sensation of endless waiting. In the afternoon, Paul and Lisa returned to the hospital to visit Margaret. They sat by her bedside, holding her cold hands. Paul watched the monitors beside the bed, the numbers and lines moving steadily, but showing no signs of improvement. "She looks so fragile," Lisa whispered, tears streaming down her face. Paul squeezed her hand. "We need to be strong for her, Lisa. We can't lose hope." As they sat there, Margaret, though unconscious, seemed to sense their presence. Deep in her mind, she struggled to emerge from the shadows of the coma, propelled by the love and determination of her family. But something held her back, a sense of imminent danger that she couldn't ignore. That night, Paul stayed in the office, reviewing more documents and company bills. There was a photo of Margaret on the desk, but he ignored it, focusing on finances and business decisions that needed to be made. Days turned into weeks, and the routine of hospital visits continued. Paul and Lisa took turns, trying to maintain a semblance of normalcy in their lives. The mansion staff did their best to support the family, but everyone felt Margaret's absence as a constant weight. One night, after a visit to the hospital, Paul stopped in the mansion garden, looking up at the stars. The air was cold and crisp, and he took a deep breath, as if seeking strength. In the distance, one of the staff members approached. "Margaret, wherever you are," he whispered to the night sky, his voice filled with emotion. "Please, come back to us. We need you." The staff member nodded, moved by Paul's apparent devotion, and discreetly withdrew. Paul then turned quickly and went back inside, his worried expression fading as he closed the door. Every day, hope fluctuated between faith and despair, but Paul refused to give up. He knew Margaret was a fighter, and somehow she would find her way back to them. Margaret slowly began to emerge from the coma. The voices and sounds around her became clearer, and she managed to open her eyes, albeit partially. Paul and Lisa were by her side, but they didn't notice the subtle movement of her eyelids. Feeling still weak and vulnerable, Margaret decided to remain still, pretending to be unconscious. "We need to talk about the will," Paul said to Lisa, his voice low but firm. Lisa looked at her father, surprised. "Now, do you think it's appropriate?" "We can't wait," Paul insisted. "If something worse happens, we need to make sure everything is in order." Margaret heard these words with a heavy heart. They were discussing dividing her fortune while she was still struggling to recover. "But what if she wakes up?" Lisa asked, her voice trembling slightly. "What are we going to do?" "We'll deal with it if it happens," Paul replied curtly. "The important thing is that we're prepared." Margaret continued to pretend, absorbing every word. She knew something was terribly wrong, but she didn't have the strength to confront them at that moment. She needed time to understand the extent of what was happening. Paul and Lisa left the room, leaving Margaret alone with her thoughts. She wanted to scream, to confront them, but she knew she needed to be strategic. She decided that for now, she would maintain her apparent coma state, waiting for the right moment to act. Days passed, and Margaret overheard more conversations between Paul and Lisa. Each visit brought more fragments of a plan that seemed increasingly dark. "I've talked to the lawyer," Paul said on one of these visits. "He's preparing the documents." Lisa seemed nervous. "Do you think it's safe to do this now?" Paul impatiently replied, "We don't have a choice. We need to do this before she wakes up." Margaret, hearing these words, felt a chill down her spine. They were preparing to take everything from her, and she needed to act fast. She decided she needed external help, someone she could trust. One morning, a nurse entered the room to perform routine procedures. Margaret, with great effort, managed to fully open her eyes. "Can you help me?" Margaret whispered, her voice weak. The nurse, surprised, looked around before approaching. "You're awake. Wait, I'll call the doctor." "No, please," Margaret pleaded, holding the nurse's hand. "I need your help. Don't tell anyone that I'm conscious, especially my husband." The nurse, confused, nodded slowly. "But why? What's going on?" "I've heard things," Margaret said, trying to control her breathing. "Terrible things. I need help to uncover the truth and protect myself." Seeing the desperation in Margaret's eyes, the nurse agreed to keep the secret. "I'll help you, but you need to rest and regain your strength." In the days that followed, the nurse helped Margaret stay informed and gain strength. They conspired in secret, trying to find out more about what Paul and Lisa were planning. On one of these occasions, the nurse brought alarming news. "I heard your husband on the phone," she said, her voice low and tense. "He was talking about transferring properties and money to offshore accounts." Margaret felt a knot in her stomach. "We need to act fast," she said, determined. "I'll pretend to be in a coma until we have enough evidence to stop them." The nurse agreed, admiring Margaret's courage. They continued to gather information, preparing for the inevitable confrontation. Margaret, now conscious and strengthened, watched Paul and Lisa's visits carefully. They never suspected that she could be hearing every word, every plan they discussed in hushed tones by her bedside. In one of these visits, Margaret heard something that made her even more determined to uncover the truth. "We need to speed up the process," Paul said, looking at Lisa with a serious expression. "We don't know how much time we have before she wakes up." "But how are we going to do that without raising suspicion?" Lisa asked, visibly worried. "Leave that to me," Paul replied confidently. "I have a plan." Margaret knew she needed to act quickly. With the help of the nurse, she began to investigate discreetly. They placed a small camera in the room, hidden among the medical equipment, to record conversations between Paul and Lisa. One afternoon, while Paul was at work and Lisa was at university, the nurse brought an envelope to Margaret. "I found this among your husband's belongings," she said, handing over the envelope. "It seems important." Margaret opened the envelope with trembling hands. Inside were a series of financial documents, revealing suspicious transactions and transfers of large sums of money to offshore accounts. It was the evidence she needed. "This is enough to prove they're up to something," Margaret said, her voice full of determination. "But we need more." In the days that followed, Margaret and the nurse continued to gather information. One night, while pretending to be asleep, Margaret overheard a revealing conversation between Paul and an unknown woman. "Linda, we need to be quick," Paul said, nervously. "If she wakes up, we're done for." "I know," Linda replied, her voice full of urgency. "But we can't afford any mistakes now." Margaret was shocked to hear Linda's name, the former family maid. What could she be doing involved in this? The nurse, upon hearing the name, was also surprised. "Was Linda very close to your family?" the nurse asked. "She worked with us for many years," Margaret explained. "But I never thought she could be involved in this." With the new information, Margaret realized that the accident was not just an accident. It was part of a carefully orchestrated plan by Paul, Lisa, and Linda to get rid of her and take her fortune. The revelation made her even more determined to expose the three of them. One morning, Margaret overheard Paul and Lisa discussing again, this time about more drastic measures. "If she doesn't wake up soon, we'll need a plan B," Paul said, his voice low but determined. "You mean?" Lisa began, but Paul interrupted her. "Yes, we don't have another choice," he replied coldly. "We need to ensure she never wakes up." Feeling the imminent danger, Margaret decided it was time to act. She urgently called for the nurse. "I need to talk to you," Margaret said, her voice low but intense. "It's an emergency." The nurse approached quickly. "What's wrong?" "I overheard Paul and Lisa. They're planning to kill me," Margaret whispered, gripping the nurse's hand. "We need to act now." The nurse, visibly alarmed, took a deep breath and said, "Margaret, if you're already strong enough to stay awake, we need to call Paul and Lisa and show them that you're conscious. It's the best way to gain time and protect yourself." Margaret nodded, agreeing. "You're right. Call them. I'm ready." The nurse quickly left the room and went to find Paul and Lisa, informing them that Margaret was awake and needed to see them. When Paul and Lisa arrived at the room, they found Margaret sitting on the bed, looking directly at them. "Mom, you're awake," Lisa exclaimed, trying to seem emotional. "Sweetheart, how are you feeling?" Paul asked, forcing a tone of concern. Margaret watched them with piercing eyes, sensing the falsehood in their expressions. She knew the real confrontation was yet to come, but for now, she had to play their game. "I'm feeling better," Margaret said, hiding her knowledge of the conspiracy. "Thank you for being here." Paul and Lisa exchanged quick glances, trying to assess the situation. Margaret knew she had to be cautious, but she was more determined than ever to expose their true intentions and protect what was hers. Margaret finally got discharged from the hospital and was taken home, still weak but determined to face her enemies. Knowing the danger she was in, she hired the nurse she trusted so much to stay with her at home. The official excuse was that she needed continuous care during her recovery. Margaret paid the nurse very well, ensuring her total dedication and distance from the hospital. "I know it's a lot to ask," Margaret said to the nurse, "but I need you here with me. It's the only way I'll feel safe." "Don't worry, Margaret," the nurse replied, firmly holding her hand. "I'll be by your side, no matter what happens." Back at the mansion, Margaret reconnected with an old friend, Private Detective James Carter. They met secretly in the garden of the house, away from Paul and Lisa's curious eyes. "James, I need your help," Margaret said, explaining the whole situation. "Paul and Lisa are plotting something terrible. I overheard conversations of them planning to kill me to get my fortune." James, with a grave expression, nodded. "This is very serious, Margaret, but I'll do everything in my power to help you." James began installing cameras and recorders in strategic points of the mansion, discreetly capturing all suspicious conversations. He spent nights analyzing the recordings while Margaret pretended to be increasingly weak and debilitated, a strategy to avoid arousing suspicion. One night, while reviewing the recordings, James found a crucial conversation between Paul and Lisa. "We need to act fast," Paul said, visibly tense. "The police investigation is heating up, and we can't afford to wait any longer." "But how are we going to do this without raising suspicions?" Lisa asked, concerned. What if they find out? Paul took a deep breath, trying to calm himself. We'll make it look like an accident. Something discreet, but effective. We don't have a choice. James knew they needed to act quickly. He met with Margaret and the nurse in the kitchen, where they discussed the next steps. We have enough evidence to incriminate them, James said. But we need to catch them red-handed. Margaret, despite the tension, remained steadfast. We need to lure Paul and Lisa into a trap. Something that forces them to reveal their true plans. James agreed, thinking of a plan. Let's create a situation where they think they have the perfect chance to act. Something they can't resist. The nurse, always by Margaret's side, offered her help. I can pretend to leave for an emergency, leaving Margaret alone. That might make them act. Margaret nodded, acknowledging the nurse's courage. It's risky, but it's our best chance. The next day, Margaret and James put the plan into action. The nurse announced that she would need to leave for a few hours due to a family emergency, leaving Margaret alone in the mansion. Paul and Lisa, believing they had the perfect opportunity, began discussing their plans in Paul's office. Now's our chance, Paul said, with a cold gleam in his eyes. Let's make it look like an accident while she's alone. Lisa, though nervous, agreed. Okay, Dad. Let's do this. James, watching everything through the cameras, prepared for the final confrontation. He alerted the police, who were ready to intervene as soon as Paul and Lisa made their move. While waiting, Margaret remained calm despite the fear she felt. She knew the truth was about to be revealed, and that justice would finally be served. Paul and Lisa went up to Margaret's room, ready to execute their plan. But as they prepared, Margaret, pretending to be weaker than she actually was, watched them with vigilant eyes. She knew every move they made was crucial. We need to do this quickly, Paul said, his voice low and urgent. She can't survive. Lisa looked at her adoptive mother, hesitating for a moment, but then returned to the plan. Yes, we have to end this. Before they could act, an unexpected noise made them stop. Margaret, sensing the opportunity, screamed with all the strength she could muster. Help! Someone, help me! Paul and Lisa turned abruptly, but it was too late. James and the police stormed the mansion, catching Paul and Lisa off guard. However, they managed to escape through the back door, running to a car that was waiting for them. In the car, Linda waited for them, eager to escape. Paul quickly got in, glancing nervously behind him. Let's go, we gotta get out of here now. Paul yelled as he stepped on the gas, leaving Margaret's property behind. As they fled, Lisa couldn't hide her fear and anxiety. Dad, what are we gonna do now? They have evidence against us. We'll lay low for a while, Paul replied, trying to stay calm. We need to plan our next move and transfer the money before they can find us. Linda, at the wheel, glanced at Paul through the rearview mirror. We have a safe place where we can hide and sort everything out. They reached a secluded house on the outskirts of town, a place Linda knew well. It was an improvised refuge, but safe enough to give them time to think about their next step. Paul immediately got to work, contacting his allies and preparing the funds transfer. We need all of Margaret's financial documents, Paul said, typing frantically on his laptop. Without them, we won't be able to transfer the money. Still shaken, Lisa asked, how are we gonna get those? The house is swarming with cops right now. Paul looked at Lisa with determination. We'll have to go back. They won't expect us to be that bold. Meanwhile, back at the mansion, Margaret, James, and the police were analyzing the collected evidence. They knew Paul and Lisa would try something desperate and were prepared for their return. James, watching the camera footage, commented, "They're gonna need the documents that are still here. It's only a matter of time before they come back." Margaret agreed, feeling more determined than ever. "We have to be ready when that happens. They can't escape again." That night, Paul, Lisa, and Linda returned stealthily to the mansion, believing that the darkness would cover their tracks. They entered through the back door and headed to Paul's office, where the financial documents were kept. "Quick, grab everything you can find," Paul ordered, frantically searching through drawers and the safe. With trembling hands, Lisa began to gather the documents. "Dad, they could find us at any moment." Paul, trying to maintain control, replied, "Just keep going. We have to be fast." Suddenly, James and Margaret burst into the office, surprising them. Margaret looked at Paul, Lisa, and Linda with a mix of sadness and anger. "How could you do this to me?" Margaret asked, her voice trembling. "I've always been good to all of you." Paul tried to respond, but Linda interrupted him. "You don't understand, Margaret. This is all your fault." Margaret looked confused. "My fault? What are you talking about?" Linda, eyes filled with resentment, began to explain. "When you were a child, your parents fired my parents from the mansion. They were desperate and got involved with organized crime to make money to take care of me. They ended up dead because of it." Margaret recoiled, shocked. "Linda, I had no idea." "You never cared to know," Linda continued, her voice full of hatred. "I grew up vowing revenge against your family. I convinced Paul to get involved in this scheme before you even got married. All this time, we've been siphoning money, and you never noticed." Margaret almost fainted upon hearing all this. "You've ruined my life over a vendetta I didn't even know existed." "You deserve to pay," Linda replied coldly. "For my parents, for everything I lost." Margaret, feeling anger rise within her, took a step forward. "That doesn't justify what you've done. You ruined my life, my trust, all because of a mistake from the past that wasn't even my fault." Paul, trying to hide his nervousness, finally intervened. "Margaret, I know this sounds terrible, but we had our reasons. And you never suspected anything because you blindly trusted us." "I trusted because I thought we were family," Margaret said, her voice choked with emotion. "Did you ever truly love me, Paul? Was this all a sham from the start?" Paul hesitated before answering, only increasing Margaret's pain. "Maybe it was a sham at first, but over time, I really did care about you." "Caring? Is that what caring looks like?" Margaret yelled, pointing to the documents in Lisa's hands. "You were ready to kill me." Lisa, visibly shaken, started to cry. "Mom, I never wanted this. I just wanted things to be different. But I got dragged into this, and now I don't know how to get out." Margaret looked at the young woman, realizing the complexity of the situation. "Lisa, you still have a choice. You can stop this now." Linda, furious, approached Lisa. "Don't listen to her, Lisa. Don't let yourself be fooled. We're in this together until the end." Margaret, addressing Linda, said firmly, "You've caused enough pain, Linda. This needs to end here." Paul, trying to keep the situation under control, raised his hands in surrender. "Let's all calm down. We can resolve this in a civilized manner." Margaret, however, knew that civility was no longer an option. "No, Paul. This has gone beyond all limits. I will fight for my life and for justice." The atmosphere in the office was tense, every second feeling like an eternity. Margaret knew the police were about to storm in, but she wanted to confront her betrayers one last time, looking into the eyes of those who had tried to destroy her life. "You will get what you deserve," Margaret declared, her voice firm and resolute. "The truth always prevails, and you will pay for everything." As the confrontation continued, the sound of sirens in the distance grew closer. The police were coming, and Margaret knew the battle was about to end once and for all. Suddenly, the police stormed into the office, interrupting the tense confrontation between Margaret, Paul, Lisa, and Linda. The officers rushed in, guns drawn, surrounding the three conspirators. In a quick and desperate move, Linda grabbed a knife and seized Margaret, holding the blade against her neck. "Everyone, drop your weapons now or I'll end her." Linda shouted, her voice filled with desperation and hatred. The police, taken aback by the situation, hesitated for a moment. James, trying to keep calm, gestured for everyone to lower their weapons. "Lower your weapons," he ordered, his voice firm. "We don't want anyone getting hurt." Paul and Lisa watched the scene, paralyzed by fear. Linda began to back away, dragging Margaret along with her. Margaret, with the knife pressed against her neck, pleaded, "Linda, please, there's no need for this. We can work this out another way." "You don't understand, Margaret," Linda growled, her eyes full of fury. "This ends here and now." As Linda moved towards the door, keeping Margaret as a hostage, no one noticed the silent arrival of the nurse, who had just entered the house. Seeing the critical situation, the nurse quickly grabbed a heavy ceramic jar from a nearby table. Linda continued to back away, holding the knife dangerously close to Margaret's neck. "Nobody stops me," Linda said threateningly. "I'm getting out of here, and no one's gonna stop me." Margaret, tears in her eyes, tried once more to appeal to Linda. "Please, Linda, you don't have to do this. Think about what you're doing." But before Linda could respond, the nurse silently approached from behind. When Linda passed by her, unaware, the nurse acted swiftly, hitting Linda on the head with the jar. Linda let out a cry of pain and fell to the ground, the knife sliding away. The police quickly advanced, immobilizing her before she could recover. "Hold her down," James ordered, as the officers handcuffed Linda. Margaret, freed from Linda's grip, fell to her knees, breathing heavily. The nurse rushed to help her, embracing her tightly. "Are you okay, Margaret?" the nurse asked, her voice filled with concern. I'm okay, thanks to you," Margaret replied, still trembling. "Thank you." As Paul and Lisa were handcuffed, Lisa began to cry desperately. "Mom, please forgive me. I never wanted this to happen. I was manipulated. Please, help me." Margaret felt a pang in her heart. Despite everything, she knew Lisa was young and had been dragged into this scheme by the influence of Paul and Linda. But even so, Margaret couldn't intervene. "I'm so sorry, Lisa," Margaret said, her voice filled with pain. "But you need to face the consequences of your actions." Lisa continued to plead